Alrighty. Wow, we got a bunch of buddies today. Yowks. Welcome to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and we're going to be continuing our reading of Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. Thanks to everyone who's tuning in. Alrighty, let's see. Previously on, we learned the definition of terroir. 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 Which is basically the geographical history or complete history of a given place. What makes a place? Generally used in wine making, as in the terroir of where you've grown the grapes. But in this case, the term being used for Area X. What makes up this place? What are the fundamental characteristics? What is it made of? What's its texture? And, well, we broke off away from that, so we don't really know what its texture is. Partly because Area X seems to do a good job of trying everything in its power to defy categorization. Almost like it's a living entity of its own. My God. There haven't been any allusions to that particular concept. Oh, wait, yes, there have. Back in the first book. And sort of here. All right. Let's see. How far is that? Can we do that today? We can do that today. We shall make it that far. I don't think today's going to be a super long one, I'm afraid. Still kind of recovering from this head cold I had earlier, but I am mostly recovered. Honestly, at the pace we're going, it'll be like today and then 2 more. So we'll have this done in 6 installments, I think. Also, the shorter one today is convenient because it ends right at a part break. So it should be perfectly fine. Right around the time I think things get downright spooky and strange. I want to say there might be an instance of bizarreness before then. We'll see. Alrighty. So get your shoes and socks on, people. It's right around the corner. Zero 015. Seventh breach. Photographs had also been buried in the sedimentary layers of the director's desk. Many were of the lighthouse from different angles, a few from various expeditions, but also reproductions of ancient daguerreotypes taken soon after the lighthouse had first been built, along with etchings and maps. The topographical anomaly as well, although fewer of these. Among them was a second copy of one of the photographs that hung on the wall opposite his desk, almost certainly the photograph the biologist had seen. That black and white photograph of the last lighthouse keeper, Saul Evans, with one of his assistants to his left, and on the right, hunched over as she clambered up some rocks, in the background, a girl whose face was half obscured by the hood of her jacket. Was her hair black, brown, or blonde? Impossible to tell from the few strands visible. She was dressed in a practical flannel shirt and jeans. The photo had a wintry feel to it, the grass in the background faded and sparse, the waves visible beyond the sand and rocks cresting in a cold kind of way. A local girl? As with so many others, they might never know who she had been. The Forgotten Coast had not been the best place to live if you cared about anyone finding you from census records. The lighthouse keeper was in his late 40s or early 50s, except Control knew you could only serve until 50, so he must have been in his 40s. A weathered face, bearded as you might expect. A sea captain's hat, even though the man had never been any kind of sailor. Control couldn't intuit much from looking at Saul Evans. He looked like a walking, talking cliché, as if he'd tried hard for years to mimic first an eccentric lay preacher whose sermons referenced hellfire, and then whatever one might expect from a lighthouse keeper. You could become invisible that way, as Control knew from his few operations in the field. Become a type, no one saw you. Paranoid thought, what better disguise? But disguise for what? The photo had been taken by a member of the Seance and Science Brigade about a week or two before the event that had created Area X. Event, by the way, is with a capital E. That rhymes with P and that stands for pool. The photographer had gone missing when the border came down. It remained the only photo of Saul Evans they had, except for some shots from 20 years earlier, well before he'd come to the coast. By the late afternoon, Control felt as if he hadn't gotten much further, just given himself a respite from governance of the Southern Reach, although even that was interrupted, again, by the sound of his reconstituted chair barricade being encountered by an apparition who turned out to be Cheney, ambitiously leaning forward across the clattery chairs so he could peer around the corner. "Hello, Cheney."
Hello, Control.
Perhaps because of his precarious position, Cheney seemed at a loss, even though he was the intruder. Or as if he had thought the office might be empty, the chairs foreshadowing some shift in hierarchy. "Yes?" Control said, not wanting to invite Cheney all the way in. The X of his face tightened, the lines unsuccessfully trying to break free and become either parallel or one line.
Oh, yes, well, I guess I just wondered if you'd followed up about, the director's trip.
This last bit delivered in a low voice, backed up by a quick glance away down the hall.
Oh, yes, well, I guess I just wondered if you'd followed up about, the director's trip.
Much better. Did Cheney have a faction too? That would be tiresome. But no doubt he did. He was the one true hope of the nervous scientists huddled in the basement, waiting to be downsized. Plucked one by one from their offices and cubicles by the giant invisible hand of Central, and then tossed into a smoldering pit of indifference and joblessness. Since I've got you here, Cheney, here's a question for you. Anything out of the ordinary about the second to last 11th expedition? Gosh, that's hard to say aloud. Another thing Control hated about the iterations. A metric mouthful to enunciate. Thank you, Control. Harder still to remember the actual number. X11H it was, right? Cheney, stabilized by some crude chair rearrangement, appeared in full, motorcycle jacket and all, in the doorway.
X11J. I don't think so. You have all the files.
But that was it. But that was just it. Control had a fairly crude report, including the intel the director had conducted. Okay. Sorry. Let's try that again. But that was just it. Control had a fairly crude report, including the intel that the director had conducted the exit interviews, which were astonishingly vague in their happy, happy, nothing bad happened message. Well, it was the direct expedition Oh, wait. Oh, no, that is him. Well, it was the expedition before the director's special trip. I thought you might have some insight. Cheney shook his head, seemed now to very much regret his intrusion.
No, nothing much. Nothing that comes to mind.
Did the director's office somehow make him uncomfortable? His gaze couldn't seem to fix on one thing, ricocheted from the far wall to the ceiling, and then, ever so briefly, like the brush of a moth's wings, touched upon the mounds of unprofessional evidence circling Control. Did Cheney think of them as piles of gold Control would steal, or piles of shit sandwiches he was being forced to eat? Let me ask you about Lowry then, Control said, thinking about the ambiguous L. Oh, wait. Thinking about the ambiguous L notes he'd found and the video he'd be watching all too soon. How did Lowry and the director get along? Cheney seemed just as uncomfortable with this question, but more willing to answer.
How does anyone get along when you think about it, really? Lowry didn't like me personally, but we got along fine professionally. He had an appreciation for our role. He knew the value of having good equipment.
Which probably meant Lowry had approved every purchase order Cheney had ever wrote. No, there is no had. Every purchase order Cheney ever wrote. But what about him and the director? Control asked. Again.
Bluntly, Lowry admired her in his way, tried to make her his protege, but she didn't want to be. She was very much her own person. And I think she thought he got too much credit for just surviving.
Wasn't he a hero? A glorious hero of the revolution, plastered on a wall, remade in the image created by a camera lens and doctored documents. Rehabilitated from his awful experiences, made productive, booted up to Central after a while.
Sure, Cheney said. Sure enough. But, maybe overrated. He liked to drink. He liked to throw his weight around. I remember the director once said something unkind, compared him to a prisoner of war who thinks just because he suffered he knows a lot. So, some friction. But they worked together, though. They did work together. Respect in opposition.
Quick flash of a smile, as if to say, "We're all comrades here." Interesting. Although, not really. Another tactical discovery. Evidence of infighting in the Southern Reach. A breakdown in organizational harmony because people weren't robots, couldn't be made to act like robots. Or could they?
Yes, if you say so,
Cheney said, and trailed off. Is there anything else? Control asked, a pointed stare beneath a frozen smile, daring Cheney to ask again about his investigation into the director's trip.
No, I guess not. Nope, nothing I can think of,
Cheney said, clearly relieved. He tossed his goodbyes in classic convoluted Cheney-esque fashion as he backed out, amble stumbling over the chairs and out of sight down the corridor. After that, Control concentrated on nothing but basic sorting, until all the bits of paper that had been Whoops. After that, Control concentrated on nothing but basic sorting, until all the bits of paper had been accounted for, and the piles safely stored in separate filing boxes for further categorizing. I thought it was categorization, and it is not. Categorizing. Although Control had noticed numerous references to the Seance and Science Brigade, he had found only 3 brief mentions of Saul Evans to go with the photo, as if the director's interests had led her elsewhere. He had, however, uncovered and set aside a sheet handwritten by the director of seemingly random words and phrases, which he eventually realized, by taking a cross-referencing peek at Grace's DMP file, had been used as hypnotic commands on the 12th expedition. Now that was interesting. He almost buzzed Cheney to talk to him about it. To ask him about it, sorry. But something made him put the phone receiver down before punching in the extension. At 6:15, Control felt a compulsion to wander out into the corridor for a good stretch. Everything lay under a hush, and even a distant radio sounded like a garbled lullaby. Roaming farther afield, he was crossing the end of the now empty cafeteria when he heard sounds coming from a storage room close to the corridor that led to the science division. Almost everyone had left, and he'd planned to leave soon himself, but the sounds distracted him. Who was in there? The elusive janitor, he hoped. The horrible cleaning product needed to be switched out. He was convinced it was a health hazard. So he grasped the knob, receiving a little electric shock as he turned it, and then wrenched outward with all of his strength. The door flew open, knocking Control back. A pale creature was crouched in front of shelves of supplies, revealed under the sharp light of a single low-swinging light bulb. An unbearable yet beatific agony deformed its features. Whitby. Breathing heavily, Whitby stared up at Control. The look of agony had begun to evaporate, leaving behind an expression of combined cunning and caution. Clearly, Whitby had just suffered some kind of trauma. Clearly, Whitby had just heard that a family member or close friend had died, even though it was Control who had received the shock. Control said, idiotically, "I'll come back later," as if they'd had a meeting scheduled in the storage room. Whitby jumped up like a trapdoor spider, and Control flinched and took a step back, certain Whitby was attacking him. Instead, Whitby pulled him into the storage room, shutting the door behind them. Whitby had a surprisingly strong grip for such a slight man. "No, no, please come in," he was saying to Control, as if he hadn't been able to speak and guide his boss inside at the same time, so that now there was a lip sync issue. "I really can come back later," Control said, still rattled, preserving the illusion that he hadn't just seen Whitby in extreme distress, and also the illusion that this was Whitby's office and not a storage space. Whitby stared at him in the dull light of the low-hung single bulb, standing close because it was crowded with the two of them in there, narrow with a high ceiling that could not be seen through the darkness above the bulb, a shield directing its light downward only. The shelves to either side of the central space displayed several rows of lemon zest cleaning product, along with stacked cans of soup, extra mop heads, garbage bags, and a few digital clocks with a heavy layer of dust on them. A long silver ladder led up into the darkness. Whitby was still composing his expression, Control realized, having to consciously wrench his frown toward a smile, wring the last clenched fear from his features. "I was just getting some peace and quiet," Whitby said. "It can be hard to find." "You looked like you were having a breakdown, to be honest," Control said, not sure he wanted to continue playing pretend. "Are you okay?" He felt more comfortable saying this now that Whitby clearly wasn't going to have a psychotic break. But he was also embarrassed that Whitby had managed so easily to trap him in here. "Not at all," Whitby said, a smile finally fitted in place, and Control hoped the man was responding to the first part of what he had said. "What can I help you with?" Control went along with this fiction, Whitby continued to offer up, if only because he had noticed that the inside lock on the door had been disabled with a blunt instrument. So Whitby had wanted privacy, but he had also been utterly afraid of being trapped in the room, too. There was a staff psychiatrist, a free resource for Southern Reach employees. Control didn't remember seeing anything in Whitby's file to indicate that he had ever gone. It took Control a moment longer than felt natural, but he found a reason. Something that would run its course and allow him to leave on the right note. Preserve Whitby's dignity. Perhaps. Nothing much, really, Control said. It's about some of the Area X theories. Whitby nodded. Yes, for example, the issue of parallel universe. Oh, wait. Oh, no, that is Whitby. Yes, for example, the issue of parallel universes, he said, as if they were picking up a conversation from some other time, a conversation Control did not remember. That maybe whatever's behind Area X came from one, Control said, stating something he didn't believe and not questioning the narrowing of focus. That, yes, Whitby said, but I've been thinking more about how every decision we make theoretically splits off from the next, so that there are an infinite number of other universes out there. Interesting, Control said. If he let Whitby lead, hopefully the dance would end sooner. And in some of them, Whitby explained, we solved the mystery, and in some of them the mystery never existed, and there never was an Area X. This said with a rising intensity, and we can take comfort in that. Perhaps we could even be content with that. His face fell as he continued. If not for a further thought, some of these universes where we solved the mystery may be separated from ours by the thinnest of membranes, the most insignificant of variations. This is something always on my mind. What mundane detail aren't we seeing, or what things are we doing that lead us away from the answer? Control didn't like Whitby's confessional tone. Confessorial isn't even a word. Control didn't like Whitby's confessional tone because it felt as if Whitby was revealing one thing to hide another, like the biologist's explanation of the sensation of drowning. This simultaneous with parallel universes of perception opening between him and Whitby as he spoke, because Control felt as if Whitby were talking about breaches, the same breaches so much on his mind on a daily basis. Whitby talking about breaches angered him in a territorial way, as if Whitby was commenting on Control's past, even though there was no logic to that. Perhaps it's your presence, Whitby, Control said. A joke, but a cruel one, meant to push the man away, close down the conversation. Maybe without you here, we would have solved it already. The look on Whitby's face was awful, caught between knowing that Control had expressed the idea with humor and the certainty that it didn't matter if it was a joke or serious. All of this conveyed in a way that made Control realize the thought was not original, but had occurred to Whitby many times. It was too insincere to follow up with, I didn't mean it, so some version of Control just left, running down the hall as fast as he was able, aware that his extraction solution was unorthodox, but unable to stop himself. Running down the green carpet while he stood there and apologized, / laughed it off, / changed the subject, / took a pretend phone call. Or, as he actually did, said nothing at all and let an awkward silence build. In retaliation, although Control didn't understand it then, Whitby said, You have seen the video, haven't you? From the first expedition? Not yet, as if he were admitting to being a virgin. That was scheduled for tomorrow. A silent shudder had passed through Whitby in the middle of delivering his own question, a kind of spasmodic attempt to fling out or reject something, but Control would leave it up to some other future version of himself to ask Whitby why. Was there a reality in which Whitby had solved the mystery and was telling it to him right now? Or a reality in which he was throttling Whitby just for being Whitby? Perhaps, sometimes, at this moment, he met Whitby in a cave after a nuclear holocaust, or in a store buying ice cream for a pregnant wife, or, wandering farther afield, perhaps in some scenarios they had met much earlier. Whitby, the annoying substitute teacher for a week in his freshman high school English class. Perhaps now he had some inkling as to why Whitby hadn't advanced farther, why his research kept getting interrupted by grunt work for others. He kept wanting to grant Whitby a localized trauma to explain his actions, kept wondering if he just hadn't gotten through enough layers to reach the center of Whitby, or if there was no center to reach and the layers defined the man. Is this the room you wanted to show me? Control asked, to change the subject.
No, why would you think that?
Whitby's cavernous eyes and sudden expression of choreographed puzzlement made him into an emaciated owl. Control managed to extricate himself a minute or so later. But he couldn't get the image of Whitby's agony-stricken face out of his head. Still had no idea why Whitby had hidden in a storage room. '016 Terroirs. At the diner counter the next morning, the cashier, a plump, gray-haired woman, asked him,
You with the folks working at that government agency on the military base?
guarded, still shaking off sleep and a little hungover. Why do you ask?
Oh, she said sweetly, they all have the same look about them, that's all.
She wanted him to ask, What look is that? Instead, he just smiled mysteriously and gave her his order. He didn't want to know what look he shared, what secret club he'd joined all unsuspecting. Did she have a chart somewhere so she could check off shared characteristics? Back in the car, Control noticed that a white mold had already covered the dead mosquito and the dried drop of blood on his windshield. His sense of order and cleanliness offended, he wiped it all away with a napkin. Who would he present the evidence of tampering to, anyway? Oh, good. We're going to get to the ill-fated first expedition video. The video of the ill-fated first expedition? Whatever. The first item on his agenda was the long-awaited viewing of the videotape taken by the first expedition. Those video fragments existed in a special viewing room in an area of the building adjacent to the quarters for expedition members. A massive white console. Oh, sorry. I don't know what is going on with me today. A massive white console sat against the far wall in that cramped space. It jutted more sharply at the top than the bottom, and mimicked the embracing shape of the Southern Reach building. Within that console, dull gray head recessed inside a severe cubist cowl, a television had been embedded that provided access to the video and nothing else. The television was an older model, dating back to the time of the first expedition, with its bulky hindquarters recessed into an alcove in the wall. Control's back still retained the groaning memory of a similar ungainly weight as a college student struggling to get a TV into his dorm room. A low black marble desk with glints of formica. Formica? I can't ever remember how that's pronounced. I've never heard it said aloud, I don't think. Well, I haven't heard it said aloud in years, so. A low black marble desk with glints of formica stood in front of the television, old-fashioned buttons and joysticks allowing for manipulation of the video content, almost like an antiquated museum exhibit or one of those quarter-fed seance machines at the carnival. A phalanx of 4 black leather conference chairs had been tucked in under the desk. Cramped quarters with the chairs pulled out, although the ceiling extended a good 20 feet above him. That should have alleviated his slight sense of claustrophobia. But it only... Oh my god. Ooh. But it only reinforced it with some minor vertigo, given the slant of the console. The vents above him, he noticed, were filthy with dust. A sharp car dashboard smell warred with a rusty mold scent. The names of 24 of the 25 members of the first expedition had been etched on large gold labels affixed to the side walls. If Grace denied that the wall of text written by the lighthouse keeper was a memorial for the former director, she could not deny that this room did serve as a memorial for that expedition, or that she served as its guardian and curator. The security clearance was so high for the video footage that of the security clearance was it's a weird line break, sorry. The security clearance was so high for the video footage that of the current employees at the Southern Reach, only the former director, Grace, and Cheney had access. Everyone else could see photo stills or read transcripts, but even then, only under carefully controlled conditions. So Grace served as his liaison because no one else could, and as she wordlessly pulled out a chair and through some arcane series of steps prepped the video footage, Control realized a change had come over her. She prepared the footage not with the malicious anticipation he might have expected, but with loving devotion and at a deliberate pace more common to graveyards than AV rooms. As if this were a neutral space, some ceasefire agreed to between them without his knowledge. The video would show him dead people who had become darkly legendary within the Southern Reach, and he could see she took her job as steward seriously. Probably in part because the director had, too. And the director had known these people, even if her predecessor had sent them to their fates. After a year of prep, there we go. With all of the best high-tech equipment that the Southern Reach could acquire or create, dooming them. Control realized his heart rate had leapt, that his mouth had become dry, and his palms sweaty. It was as if he were about to take a very important test, one with consequences. "It's self-explanatory," Grace said finally. "The video is queued up to the beginning and proceeds, with gaps, chronologically. You can move from clip to clip. You can skip around, whatever you prefer. If you are not finished by the end of 1 hour, I will come in here and your session will be over." They had recovered more than 150 fragments, most of the surviving footage lasting between 10 seconds and 2 minutes. Some recovered by Lowry, others by the fourth expedition. They did not recommend watching the footage for more than an hour at any one time. Few had spent that long with it. "I will also be waiting outside. You can knock on the door if you're done early." Control nodded. Did that mean he was to be locked in? Apparently it did. Grace relinquished her seat. Control took her place, and as she left there came an unexpected hand on his shoulder, perhaps putting more weight into the gesture than necessary. Then came the click of the door lock from outside as she left him alone in a marble vault lined with the names of wraiths. Control had asked for this experience, but now did not really want it. The earliest sequences showed the normal things, setting up camp, the distant lighthouse jerkily coming into view from time to time. The shapes of trees and tents showed up dark in the background. Blue sky wheeled across the screen as someone lowered the camera and forgot to turn off the camcorder. Some laughter, some banter, but Control was, like a seer or a time traveler, suspicious already. Were those the expected, normal things? The banal camaraderie displayed by human beings? Or instead harbingers of secret communiques, subcutaneous and potent? Control hadn't wanted the interference, the contamination of someone else's analysis or opinions, so he hadn't read everything in the files. But he realized right then that he was too armored with foreknowledge anyway, and too cynical about his caution not to find himself ridiculous. If he wasn't careful, everything would be magnified, misconstrued, until each frame carried the promise of menace. He kept in mind the note from another analyst that no other expedition had encountered what he was about to see. Among those that had come back, at least. A few segments from the expedition leader's video journal followed at dusk, caught in silhouette, campfire behind her, reporting nothing that Control didn't already know. Then about 7 entries followed, each lasting 4 or 5 seconds, and these showed nothing but blotchy shadow, night shots with no contrast. He kept squinting into that murk, hoping some shape, some image would reveal itself. But in the end, it was just the self-fulfilling prophecy of black dust motes floating across the corners of his vision, like tiny orbiting parasites. A day went by, with the expedition spreading outward in waves from the base camp, with Control trying not to become attached to any of them. Not swayed by the charm of their frequent joking, nor by the evident seriousness and competence of them, some of the best minds the southern reach could find. The clouds stretched long across the sky. A sobering moment when they encountered the sunken remains of a line of abandoned jeeps and pickup trucks, their drivers, trapped inside the border, nowhere to be found. The equipment had already been covered over in loam and vines. By the time of the 4th expedition, Control knew, all traces of it would be gone. Area X would have requisitioned it for its own purposes, privilege of the victor. But there were no human remains to disturb the first expedition, although Control could see frowns on some faces. By then, too, if you listened carefully, you could begin to hear the disruption of transmissions on the walkie-talkies issued to the expedition members, more and more queries of, "Come in," and "Are you there?" followed by static. Another evening, the dawn of another day, and Control felt as if he were moving along at a rapid clip, almost able to relax into the closed vessel formed by each innocuous moment, and to live there in blissful ignorance of the rest. Even though by now the disruption had spread, so that queries via walkie-talkie had become verbal miscues and misunderstandings. Listener and listened to had begun to be colonized by some outside force, but had not yet realized it. Or, at least, not voiced concerns for the camera. Control chose not to rewind these instances. They sent a prickling shiver across the back of his neck, gave him a faint sensation of nausea, increased the destabilizing sense of vertigo and claustrophobia. Finally, though, Control could no longer fool himself. The famous 20-second clip had come up, which the file indicated had been shot by Lowry, who had served as both the team's anthropologist and its military expert. Dusk of the second day, with a lisp of sunset. Dull, dark tower of the lighthouse in the middle distance. In their innocence, they had not seen the harm in splitting up, and Lowry's group had decided to bivouac on the trail, among the remains of an abandoned series of houses about halfway to the lighthouse. It had hardly been enough to constitute a village, with no name on the maps, but had been the largest population center of the area, in the area. A rustling sound Control associated with sea oats and the wind off the beach, but faint. The wreckage of the old walls formed deeper shadows against the sky, and he could just see the wide line that was the stone path running through. In the clip, Lowry shook a bit, holding the camera. In the foreground, a woman, the expedition leader, was shouting, "Get her to stop!" Her face was made a mask by the light from the recorder and the way it formed such severe shadows around her eyes and mouth. Opposite, across a kind of crude picnic table that appeared fire-burned, a woman, the expedition leader, shouted, "Get her to stop! Please stop! Get her to stop! Please!" A lurch and spin of the camera, and then the camera steadied, presumably with Lowry still holding it. Lowry began to hyperventilate, and Control realized that the sound he had heard before was a kind of whispered breathing, with a shallow rattle threading through it. Not the wind at all. He could also just hear urgent, sharp voices from off camera, but couldn't make out what they were saying. The woman on the left of the screen then stopped shouting and stared into the camera. The woman on the right also stopped shouting, stared into the camera. An identical fear and pleading and confusion radiated from the masks of their faces toward him, from so far away, from so many years away. He could not distinguish between the two manifestations, not in that murky light. Then, sitting bolt upright, even knowing what was to come, Control realized it was not dusk that had robbed the setting behind them of any hint of color. It was more as if something had interceded on the landscape, something so incredibly large that its edges were well beyond the camera's lens. In the last second of the videotape, the two women still frozen and staring, the background seemed to shift and keep shifting, followed by a clip even more chilling to Control. Lowry in front of the camera this time. Lowry in front of the camera this time, goofing off on the beach the next morning, and whoever was behind the camera laughing. No mention of the expedition leader. No sign of her on any of the subsequent video footage, he knew. No explanation from Lowry. It was as if she had been erased from their memories, or as if they had all suffered some vast, unimaginable trauma while off camera that night. But the dissolution continued, despite their seeming happiness and ease. For Lowry was saying words that had no meaning, and the person holding the camera responded as if she could understand him, her own speech not yet deformed. Carnage followed him from the video screening when he finally left, escorted by Grace back into the light, or a different kind of light. Carnage might follow him for a while. He wasn't sure, was having difficulty putting things into words, had done little more than mumble and nod to Grace when she asked him if he was okay, while she held his arm as if she were holding him up. Yet he knew that her compassion came with a price, that he might pay for it later. So he extricated himself, insisted on leaving her behind and walking the rest of the way back in solitude. He had a full day ahead of him still. He had to recover. Next was his scheduled time with the biologist, and then status meetings, and then he forgot what was next. Stumbled, tripped, leaned on one knee, realized he was in the cafeteria area and its familiar green carpet with the arrow pattern pointing in from the courtyard. Caught by the light streaming from those broad, almost cathedral-like windows. It was sunny outside, but he could already see the angry gray in the middle of white clouds that signaled more afternoon showers. In the black water, with the sun shining at midnight, those fruits shall come ripe, and in the darkness of that which is golden shall split open to reveal the revelation of the fatal softness in the earth. A lighthouse, a tower, an island, a lighthouse keeper, a border with a huge shimmering door. A director who might have gone AWOL across that border, through that door. A squashed mosquito on his windshield. Whitby's anguished face. The swirling light of the border. The director's phone in his satchel. Demonic videos housed in a memorial catafalque. Details were beginning to overwhelm him. Details were beginning to swallow him up. No chance yet to let them settle, or to know which were significant, which trivial. He'd hit the ground running, as his mother had wanted, and it wasn't getting him very far. He was in danger of incoming information outstripping his prep work, the knowledge he'd brought with him. He'd exhausted so many memorized files, burned through tactics. And he'd have to dig into the director's notes in earnest soon, and that would bring with it more mysteries, he was sure. The screaming had gone on and on toward the end. The one holding the camera hadn't seemed human. Wake up, he had pleaded with the members of the first expedition as he watched. Wake up and understand what is happening to you. But they never did. They couldn't. They were miles away, and he was more than 30 years too late to warn them. Control put his hand on the carpet, the green arrows up close, composed of threads of a curling, intertwined fabric almost like moss. He felt its roughness, how threadbare it had become over the years. Was it the original carpet from 30 years ago? If so, every major player in those videos, in the files, had strode across it, had crisscrossed it hundreds and hundreds of times. Perhaps even Lowry, holding his camcorder, joking around before their expedition. It was as worn down as the Southern Reach, as the agency moved along its appointed grooves on this funhouse ride that was called Area X. People were staring at him, too, as they crisscrossed the cafeteria. He had to get up. From the dim-lit halls of other places, forms that never could be writhe. Control went from bended knee to the interrogation room with the biologist, after a brief interlude in his office. He had needed some form of relief, some way to cleanse. He'd called up the information on Rock Bay, the biologist's longest assignment before she'd joined the 12th expedition. From her field notes and sketches, he could tell it was her favorite place. A rich northern rainforest with a verdant ecosystem. She'd rented a cottage there, and in addition to photographs of the tidal pools she'd studied, he had shots of her living quarters, Central's routine, thorough follow-up. The cot-like bed, the comfortable kitchen, and the black stove in the corner that doubled as a fireplace, the long spout going up into a chimney. There were aspects of the wilderness that appealed to him, that calmed him, but so too did the simple domesticity of the cottage. Why do I keep doing that? But so too did the simple domesticity of the cottage. Once seated in the room, Control placed a bottle of water and her files between them. A gambit he was bored with, but nevertheless. His mother had always said the repetition of ritual made pointing to the thing. Oh, I see. His mother had always said that the repetition of ritual made pointing to the thing that had been rendered invisible all the more dramatic. Some day soon he might point to the files and make an offer. The fluorescent lights pulsed and flickered, something beginning to devolve in them. He didn't care if Grace watched from behind the glass or not. Ghostbird looked terrible today, not so much sick, but like she had been crying, which was how he felt. There was a darkness around her eyes, and a slump to her posture. Any recklessness or amusement had been burned away, or gone into hiding. Control didn't know where to start because he didn't want to start at all. What he wanted to talk about was the video footage, but that was impossible. The words would linger, form in his mind, but never become sound, trapped between his need and his will. He couldn't tell any human being, ever. If he let it out, contaminated someone else's mind, he would not forgive himself. A girlfriend who had gleaned some sense of his job had once asked, "Why do you do it?" Meaning, why serve such a clandestine purpose? A purpose that could not be shared, could not be revealed. He'd given his standard response, in a portentous manner, to poke fun at himself, to disguise the seriousness, to know, to go beyond the veil, across the border. Even as Control said it, he had known that he was also telling her he didn't mind leaving her there, alone, on the other side. "What would you like to talk about?" he asked Ghostbird, not because he was out of questions, but because he wanted her to take the lead. "Nothing," she said, listless. The word came out at a muttering slant. "There must be something." Pleading. Let there be something, to distract from the carnage in my head. "I am not the biologist." That brought Control out of himself, forced him to consider what she meant. "You are not the biologist," he echoed. "You want the biologist. I'm not the biologist. Go talk to her, not to me." Was this some kind of identity crisis, or just metaphorical? Either way, he realized that this session had been a mistake. "We can try again in the afternoon," he said. "Try what?" she snapped. "Do you think this is therapy? Who for?" He started to respond, but in one violent motion she swept his files and water off the table and grabbed his left hand with both of hers and wouldn't let go. Defiance and fear in her eyes. "What do you want from me? What do you really want?" With his free hand, Control waved off the guards plunging into the room. From the corner of his eye, their retreat had a peculiar suddenness, as if they'd been sucked back into doorways by something invisible and monstrous. "Nothing," he said, to see how she'd respond. Her hand was clammy and warm, not entirely pleasant. Something was definitely going on beneath her skin. Had her fever gotten worse? "I won't assist in charting my own pathology," she hissed, breathing hard, shouting, "I am not the biologist!" He pulled himself loose, pushed away from the table, stood and watched as she fell back into her seat. She stared down at the table, wouldn't look up at him. He hated to see her distress, hated worse that he seemed to have caused it. "Whoever you are, we'll pick this up later," he said. "Humoring me," she muttered, arms folded. But by the time he'd picked up the bottle of water and his scattered files and made it to the door, something had changed in her again. Her voice trembled on the cusp of some new emotion. "There was a mating pair of wood storks in the holding pond out back when I left. Are they still there?" It took a moment to realize she meant when she'd left on the expedition. Another moment to realize that this was almost an apology. "I don't know," he said. "I'll find out." What had happened to her out there? What had happened to him in here? The last fragment of video remained in its own category, unassigned. Everyone was dead by then, except for an injured Lowry, already halfway back to the border. Yet, for a good 20 seconds, the camera flew above the glimmering marsh reeds, the deep blue lakes, the ragged white cusp of the sea, toward the lighthouse. Dipped and rose, fell again, and soared again, with what seemed like a horrifying enthusiasm, an all-consuming joy. Zero 017. Perspective. Steps had begun to go missing. Steps had begun to occur out of step. Lunch followed a status meeting that, the moment it was done, Control barely remembered, no matter how hard he tried. He was here to solve a puzzle in some ways, but he felt as if it were beginning to solve him instead. Control had talked for a while, he knew that, about how he wanted to know more about the lighthouse and its relationship to the topographical anomaly. After which, Sue said something about the patterns in the lighthouse keeper's sermon, while the sole member of the props department, a hunched-over elderly man named Darcy, with a crinkly tinfoil voice, added commentary throughout her talk, referring to the crucial role now and in the future of the historical accuracy division. Trees framed the campfire, the members of the expedition around the campfire. Something so large you couldn't see its outline, crawling or lumbering through the background, obscenely threaded between the trees and the campfire. He didn't like to think about what could be so large and yet so lithe as to thread like that, to conjure up the idea of a fluid wall of ribbony flesh. Perhaps he could have continued to nod and ask questions, but he had become more and more repulsed by the way Sue's assistant, Amy something, chewed on her lip. Slowly, methodically, without thought, as she scribbled notes or whispered some piece of information in Sue's ear. The off-white of her upper left cuspid and incisors would appear, the pink gum exposed as the upper lip receded, and then with almost rhythmic precision she would nip and pincer the left side of her lower lip, which over time became somewhat redder than her lipstick. Something had brushed through or interceded across the screen for a moment in the background, while in the middle a man with a beard squatted. Not Lowry, but a man named O'Connell. At first, Control had thought O'Connell was mumbling, was saying something in a language he didn't understand. And, trying to find logic, trying to grasp, Control had almost buzzed Grace right then to tell her about his discovery. But by another few frames, Control could tell that the man was actually chewing on his lip, and continued chewing until the blood came, the whole time resolutely staring into the camera, because there was, Control slowly realized, no other safe place to look. Wait, no, sorry. I botched it. But by another few frames, Control could tell that the man was actually chewing on his lip, and continued chewing until the blood came, the whole time resolutely staring into the camera because there was, Control slowly realized, no other place safe enough to look. O'Connell was speaking as he chewed, but the words weren't anything unique now that Control had read the wall. It was the most primal and thus most banal message imaginable. Predictable lunch to follow in the cafeteria. Stabilizing lunch, he'd thought, but lunch repeated too many times became a meaningless word that morphed into lunge, that became lunged, that became a leaping white rabbit, that became the biologist at the depressing table, that became an expedition around a campfire, unaware of what they were about to endure. Control followed a version of Whitby he was both wary of and concerned about, and who muddled his way through the tables, with Cheney, Sue, and Grace trailing behind him. Whitby hadn't been in the status meeting, but Grace had seen him ducking into a side corridor as they'd walked downstairs and roped him into their lunch. Then it had just been a case of everyone deferring to Whitby in his natural habitat. Whitby couldn't like the cafeteria for the food. It had to be the open air quality of the space, the clear lines of sight. Perhaps it was simply that you could escape in any direction. Whitby led them to a round faux wooden table with low plastic seats, all of it jammed up against the corner farthest from the courtyard, which abutted stairs that led to the largely empty space known as the third level that they had just vacated, really a glorified landing with a few conference rooms. Control realized Whitby had chosen the table so he could cram his slight frame into the semicircle closest to the wall, a wary if improbable gunslinger with his back to the stairs, looking out across the cafeteria to the courtyard and the fuzzy green of a swamp dissolving in humid bubbles of condensation against the glass. Control sat facing Grace, with Whitby and Sue flanking Grace to right and left. Cheney plopped into the seat next to Control, opposite Whitby. Control began to suspect some of them weren't there by chance, or voluntarily, the way Grace seemed to be commandeering the space. The huffing X of Cheney's face leaned in, solicitous, as he said, "I'll hold down the fort while you get your food and go after." "Just get me a pear or an apple and some water, and I'll stay here instead," Control said. He felt vaguely nauseated. Cheney nodded, withdrew his thick hands from the table with a slap, and left, along with the others, while Control contemplated the large framed photo hanging on the wall. Old and dusty, it showed the core of the Southern Reach team at the time. Control recognized some faces from his various briefings, zeroing in on Lowry, come back for a visit from Central, still looking haggard. Whitby was there, too, grinning near the center. The photo suggested that at one time Whitby had been inquisitive, quick, optimistic, perhaps even impishly proactive. The missing director was just a hulking shadow off at the left edge. She loomed, committed to neither a smile nor a frown. At that time, she would have been a relatively new hire, an apprentice to the staff psychologist. Grace would have joined about 5 years later. It could not have been easy for either of them to make their way up the hierarchy and hold on to their power. That had taken toughness and perseverance. Perhaps too much. But at least they had both missed the crazier manifestations of the early days, of which the hypnosis was the only surviving remnant. Cryptozoologists, an almost seance, the bringing in of psychics, given the bare facts and asked to produce what? Information? No information could be extracted from their divinations. The others returned from the buffet, Cheney with a pear on a plate, and the asked-for water. Control reflected that if something terrible happened later that day and forensics tried to reconstruct events from the contents of their stomachs, Cheney would look like a fussy bird, Whitby like a pig, Sue a health nut, and Grace a mere nibbler. She sat back in her seat, glaring at him now, with her 2 packets of crackers and coffee arranged in front of her as if she planned to use it as evidence against him. He braced himself, trying to clear his head with a sip of water. "Status meetings every Thursday or every other Thursday?" "Every Thursday or every other Thursday?" There we go. right emphasis on the correct syllable. Status meetings every Thursday or every other Thursday? He asked, just to test the waters and make conversation. He clamped down on an automatic impulse to use the question to begin a sly exploration of department morale. But Grace didn't want to make conversation. "Do you want to hear a story?" she said, and it wasn't a question. She looked as if she had made up her mind about something. "Sure," Control said. "Why not?" While Cheney fidgeted next to him, and Whitby and Sue simultaneously seemed to flatten and become smaller, looking away from Grace as if she'd become a repelling magnet. Her stare bore down on him, and he lost the urge to gnaw on his pear. "It concerns a certain domestic terrorism operative." "Here it comes, there it goes." "How interesting," Control said. "I was in domestic terrorism for a while." Continuing on as if Control hadn't said a word. The story is about a blown field assignment, this operative's third out of training. Not his first or his second, but his third, so no real excuses. What was his job? He was to observe and report on separatist militia members on the northwest coast, based in the mountains but coming down into two key port cities to recruit. Central had believed that the radical cells in this militia had the will and resources to disrupt shipping, blow up a building, many things. No coherent political views or vision, just ignorant white men mostly, college age but not in college, a few radicalized women, and then the usual others unaware of what their ignorant men were up to, none of them as stupid as the operative. Control sat very still. He began to feel as if his face were cracking. He was getting warmer and warmer, a tingling flame spreading slowly throughout his body. Was she trying to tear him down, stone by stone, in front of the few people at the Southern Reach with whom he already had some kind of a rapport? Cheney had gotten in some huffing sounds to express his disapproval of where this might be going. Whitby looked as if a stranger walking toward him from very far away was trying to give him the details of an interesting conversation, but he wasn't quite close enough to hear about it yet. So sorry, not his fault. "Sounds familiar," Control said, because it did, and he even knew what came next. "The operative infiltrates the group, or the edges of the group," Grace said. "He gets to know some of the friends of the people at the core of it." Sue, frowning, focused on something of interest on the carpet. As she got up with her tray, managed a cheerful if abrupt goodbye, and left the table.
Not fair, Grace, you know that,
Cheney whispered, leaning forward as if somehow he could direct his words solely to her.
An ambush.
But by Control's own reckoning, it was fair. Very fair. Given that they hadn't agreed to ground rules ahead of time. This operative starts following the friends, and, eventually, they lead him to a bar. The girlfriend of the second in command likes to have a drink at this bar. She is on the list. He has memorized her photograph. But instead of just observing her and reporting back, this clever, clever operative ignores his orders and starts to talk to her there in this bar. "Do you want me to tell the rest of the story?" Control interrupted. Because he could. He could tell it, wanted to tell it, had a fierce desire to tell it, and felt a perverse gratitude toward Grace, because this was such a human problem, such a banal human problem compared to all the rest.
Grace?
Cheney, imploring. But Grace waved them both off, faced Whitby so that Whitby had no other choice but to look at her. "Not only does he have a conversation with this woman, Whitby, not only does he have a conversation with this woman, Whitby, Whitby, as startled by the complicity of his name as if she had put her arm around him. But he seduces her, telling himself that he is doing it to help the cause, because he is an arrogant man, because he is too far off his leash. Mother had typified that as hearsay, as she had typified a lot of things, but in this case she had been right. We used to have forks and spoons in the cafeteria, Whitby said mournfully. Now we just have sporks. He turned to the left, then the right, looking either for alternative cutlery or for a quick exit. Or for a quick way to exit. Sorry. Next time you tell this story, you should leave out the seduction, which didn't happen, Control said, a spiral of ash in his head and a faint ringing in his ears. You could also add that the operative didn't have clear orders from his superior.
You heard the man. You heard him.
The Cheney murmur, as subtle as a donkey burp. Grace kept speaking directly to Whitby, with Whitby now swiveling toward Cheney, the expression asking Cheney what he should do, and Cheney unable or unwilling to give him guidance. Let it play out to the bitter end. Draw the poison. This was trench warfare. This was always going to continue. So the operative beds the girlfriend. No triumph in her voice, at least, although he knows it is dangerous, knows that the members of the militia might find out. His supervisor does not know what he is doing. Yet. And then one day, Control interrupted, because she was going to tell this story. Because if she was going to tell this story, she should get the rest of it right. God fucking damn it! One day he goes to the bar. This is only the third time, and gets made by surveillance cameras put in overnight by the boyfriend. Control hadn't spoken to her the second time in the bar. That third and final time, yes. How he wished he hadn't. He couldn't even remember what he'd said to her, or her to him. Correct, Grace said, a momentary confused expression adding weight to her face. Correct. It was an old scar by now for Control, even if it seemed like a fresh wound to every scavenger that tried to dip their beak or snout into it to tear away some spoiled meat. The routine of telling the story transformed Control from a person into an actor dramatizing an ancient event from his own life. Every time he had to reenact it, the monologue became smoother, the details less complex and more easily fitted together, the words like stuffing puzzle pieces into his mouth and spewing them out in the perfect order to form a picture. He disliked the performance more each time. But the only other choice was to be blackmailed by a part of his past now more than 17 years and 5 months gone by. Even though it followed him around to each new job because his supervisor at the time had decided Control deserved, forever, more punishment than he'd received at the point of impact. In the worst versions, like the one Grace had started to tell, he'd slept with the girlfriend, Rachel McCarthy, and had compromised operations beyond repair. But the truth had been bad enough. He had come out of private college as his mother's protege. Excellent grades, a kind of unthinking swagger, and completion of training at Central with high marks. He'd had great success in the field, the first 2 times out, tracking good old boys across flat plains and gentle hills in the middle of the country, pickups and chewing tobacco in lonely little town squares, snacking on fried okra while he watched guys in baseball caps load suspicious boxes into the backs of vans. I made a terrible mistake. I think about it every day. It guides me in my job now. It makes me humble and keeps me focused. But he didn't think about it every day. You didn't think about it every day, or it would rise up and consume you. It just remained there, nameless. A sad, dark thing that weighed you down only some of the time. When the memory became too faint, too abstract, it would transform itself into the old rotator cuff injury, a pain so thin yet so sharp that he could trace the line of it all the way across his shoulder blade and down his back. So then, Control said, Whitby beginning to be crushed by their tandem attention, and Cheney gone, having orchestrated a subtle jailbreak right under Control's nose. So then, the boyfriend has it on tape that some stranger was talking to his girlfriend, which would probably be enough for a beating. But then he has a comrade follow this stranger to a cafe, about 20 minutes away by car. The operative doesn't notice. He's forgotten to take the steps to see if he was being tailed, because he's so thrilled with himself and so confident in his abilities. Because he was part of a dynasty. Because he knew so much. And guess who the operative is talking to? His supervisor. Only members of this militia had a run-in with the supervisor a few years back, which, it turns out, is why it's me in the field rather than him in the first place. So now they know the person talking to his girlfriend is comparing notes with a known government agent. Here he deviated from the script long enough to remind Grace of what he had endured just that morning. It was like I was floating above it all, above everyone, looking down, gliding through the air, able to do anything I wanted to. Saw the connection register with her, but not the guilt. Now they know that a member of their militia has had contact with the government. And on top of that, the boyfriend, as noted, is the possessive, controlling, jealous type. And that the boyfriend works himself into a rage, watching the operative come back the next day, not doing much more than nodding at McCarthy, but for all he knows, they've got a secret method of communication. It's enough that the operative has come back. The boyfriend gets it into his head that his girlfriend might be part of it, that maybe McCarthy is spying on them. So what do you think they do? Whitby took the opportunity to give an answer to a different question. He slid out from behind the table and ran away down the curve of the wall, headed for the science division, without even a hurried goodbye, leaving Control with Grace. Aren't you gonna guess? Control asked Grace, turning the full weight of his anger and self-loathing on the assistant director, not caring that all eyes in the cafeteria were on them. To reanimate the emotions of a dead script, he had started thinking of things like topographical anomalies, and video of the first expedition, and hypnotic conditioning. Inverse to the extreme. Inverse to the extreme where ritual decreed he hold words in his head like horrible goiter and math homework to stop from coming too soon during sex. Are you going to fucking guess? He hissed in a kind of mega whisper, wanting to confess not to anyone in the audience, but to the biologist. They shoot Rachel McCarthy, she said. Yes, that's right! Control shouted, knowing that even the people serving the food at the far distant buffet could hear him, were looking at him. Maybe 15 people remained there in the cafeteria, most trying to pretend none of this was happening. They shoot Rachel McCarthy, Control said. Although by the time they're searching for me, I'm already safe at home. After, what, 2 or 3 conversations? A standard surveillance operation from my perspective. I'm being pulled in for a debriefing while other, more seasoned agents are being brought in to follow up on the lead. Except by then, the militia has beaten McCarthy half senseless and driven her to the top of an abandoned quarry. And they want her to tell the truth, to just tell the truth about the person in the bar, which she can't do because she's innocent and didn't know I was an operative. But that's the wrong answer. Any answer is the wrong answer by then. Will always be the wrong answer. And around the time that he's excited he helped crack the case wide open and a judge is issuing warrants, the boyfriend has shot McCarthy in the head and let her fall dead into the shallow water below, to be found 3 days later by the local police. Anyone else might have been finished, although he'd been too green to know that. He hadn't known until years later that his mother had rescued him, for better or for worse. Called in favors, pulled strings, greased palms. All the usual cliches that masked every unique collusion. Because, she told him when she finally confessed, when it no longer mattered one way or the other, she believed in him and knew that he had much more to offer. Control had spent a year on suspension, going to therapy that couldn't repair the breach, endured a retraining program that cast a broad net to catch a tiny mistake that kept escaping anyway over and over in his mind. Then he had been given an administrative desk job, from which he'd worked his way up through the ranks again, to the exalted position of to the exalted non-position of fixer, with the clear understanding that he'd never be deployed in the field again. So that one day he could be called upon to run a peculiar backwater agency. So that what he couldn't bring himself to confess to any of his girlfriends, he could shout out loudly in a cafeteria in front of a woman who appeared to hate him. The little bird he'd seen flying darkly against the high windows of the cafeteria flew there still, but the way it flitted reminded him now more of a bat. The rain clouds gathered yet again. Grace still sat in front of him, guarded from on high by cohorts from the past. Control still sat there, too, Grace now going through his lesser sins, one by one, in no particular order, with no one else left to hear. She had read his file and gotten her hands on more besides. As she reeled it off, she told him other things. About his mother, his father, the litany, a lurching parade or procession that, curiously, no longer hurt about halfway through. A kind of numb relief, instead, began to flood Control. She was telling him something, all right. She saw him clearly, and she saw him well, from his skills right down to his weaknesses, from his short relationships to his nomadic lifestyle, to his father's cancer and ambivalence about his mother. The ease with which he had embraced his mother's substitution of her job for family, for religion. And all of the rest of it. All of it, her tone of voice managing the neat trick of mixing grudging respect with compassionate exasperation at his refusal to retreat. "Have you never made a mistake?" he asked, but she ignored him. Instead, she gave him the gift of a motive. "This time your contact tried to cut me off from Central. For good." The voice, continuing to help him in the same way as a runaway bull. "I didn't ask for that." Well, if he had, he didn't want it any more. "You went into my office again." "I didn't." But he couldn't be sure. "I'm trying to keep things the way they are for the director, not for me." The director's dead. The director's not coming back. She looked away from him, out through the windows at the courtyard and the swamp beyond. A fierce look that shut him out. Maybe the director was flying free over Area X, or scrabbling with root broken fingernails into the dirt, the reeds, trying to get away from something. But she wasn't here. Think about how much worse it could get, Grace, if they replace me with someone else. Because they're never going to make you director. Truth for truth. You know, I did you a favor just now, she said, pivoting away from what he'd said. A favor? Sure you did. But he did know. That which was uncomfortable or unflattering she had now offloaded pointlessly, ordnance wasted, a gun shot into the air. She had let out the rest of the items in her jewelry box of condemnation, and by not hoarding told him she would not be using it in the future. You're a lot like us, she said. Someone who has made a lot of mistakes. Someone just trying to do better. To be better. Subtext. You can't solve what hasn't been solved in 30 years. I won't let you get out ahead of the director. And what misdirection in that? What was she pushing him toward or away from? Control just nodded, not because he agreed or disagreed, but because he was exhausted. Then he excused himself, locked the cafeteria bathroom, and vomited up his breakfast. He wondered if he was coming down with something, or if his body was rejecting, as viciously as possible, everything in the Southern Reach. Zero 018. Recovery. Cheney came back to prowl around outside the bathroom, concerned, whispering, "Do you think you're all right, man?" as if they'd become best buddies. But eventually Cheney went away, and a little while later Control's cell phone rang just as he'd propped himself up on the toilet seat. He pulled the phone out of his pocket. The voice. The bathroom seemed like the perfect place to take this call. Cold porcelain, after having slammed the bathroom door shut, was a relief. So were the tiny, cool blue tiles of the floor. Even the faint whiff of piss. All of it. Any of it. Why were there no mirrors in the men's room?
Next time, take my call when I call, the voice warned, with the implication that she/he was a busy woman/man, just as Control noticed the flashing light that meant he had a message.
I was in a meeting.
I was watching videotape. I was talking to the biologist. I was getting my ass handed to me by the assistant director because of you. Is your house in order? The voice asked. Is it in order? 2,000 white rabbits herded toward an invisible door. A plant that didn't want to die. Impossible video footage. More theories than there were fish in the sea. Was his house in order? An odd way for the voice to phrase it, as if they spoke using a code which Control did not have the key. Yet it made him feel secure, even though that was counterintuitive. Are you there? The voice asked brusquely.
Yes, my house is in order.
Then what do you have for me?
Control gave the voice a brief summary. The voice considered that for a moment, then asked,
So do you have an answer now?
To what?
To the mystery behind Area X.
The voice laughed an oddly tinny, metallic laugh.
Ha, 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 ha.
Enough of this. Stop trying to cut Grace off from her contacts at Central. It isn't working, and it's making it harder, Control said. Remembering her care with setting up the videos of the first expedition, too wrung out by lunch to process it yet. Twinned to Control's disgust at the voice's clearly inadequate and extreme tactics was the sudden conviction, admittedly irrational, that somehow the voice was responsible for sticking him in the middle of the southern reach. If the voice actually was his mother, then he'd be correct about that.
Listen, John, the voice growled. I don't report to you. You report to me, and don't forget that.
Meant to be delivered with conviction, and yet somehow failing. Stop trying, Control repeated. You're doing harm to me. She knows you're trying. Just stop.
Again, I don't report to you, Control. Don't tell me what to do. You asked me to fix it, and I'm trying to fix it.
Feedback made Control take the phone away from his ear. You know, I saw the video of the first expedition this morning, he said. It threw me. By way of half-hearted apology. Grandpa had taught him that. Redirect while seeming to address the other party's grievance. It had been done enough to him in the past. But for some reason that set the voice off.
You think that's a fucking excuse for not doing your goddamn job? Seeing a video? Get your head out of your asshole and give me a real report next time. Then maybe I'll be a lot more willing to do your bidding the way you want me to do your bidding. Got it, fuckface?
The swear words were delivered in a peculiar, halting way, as if the voice were completing a Mad Lib where the only scripted parts were the words fucking, goddamn, asshole, and fuckface. But Control got it. The voice was a shithead. He'd had shithead bosses before. Unless the real voice was taking a break and this was the sub's attempt at improv.
Megalodon mad. Megalodon not happy. Megalodon have tantrum.
So he gave in and made some conciliatory sounds. Then he elaborated and told the tale of his progress. The story, structured and strung together, not as the plaintive, halting start-stop of what the hell that it was, but instead as an analytical and nuanced journey that could only be interpreted as having as a beginning and a middle, pushing out toward a satisfying end.
Enough,
the voice said at some point. Later.
That's better,
the voice said. Control couldn't really tell if the severity of that rushed cheese grater on cheese grater tone had lightened.
For now, continue to collect data and continue to question the biologist, but press her harder.
Had already done that, and it had gone poorly. Uncovering useful intel was often a long-term project, a matter of listening for what didn't matter to fall away for just a moment. After another pause, the voice said,
I have that information you asked for.
Which information? Plant? Mouse? Or...
I can confirm that the director did cross the border.
Control sat up straight on the toilet seat. Someone was knocking timidly at the door. They'd have to wait. When? Right before the 11th expedition?
Yes, completely unauthorized and without anyone's knowledge or permission.
And she got away with it.
What do you mean?
She wasn't fired. A pause. Then the voice said,
No doubt she should have been terminated. But no, she got a probation. The assistant director took her place for 6 months.
Impatient, as if it didn't matter. What was he supposed to do with that? Probably a question for his mother. because surely someone higher up must have known the director was going across the border, and then someone had protected her when she came back. Do you know how long she was gone? Is there a report of what she found?
3 weeks. No report.
3 weeks? She must have been debriefed. There must be a record. A much longer pause. Was the voice consulting with another voice or voices? Finally, the voice conceded the point.
There is a debriefing statement. I can have a copy sent to you.
Did you know that the director thought the border was advancing? Control asked.
I am aware of that theory, the voice said, but it is no concern of yours.
How was that no concern of his? How did someone go from calling him a fuckface to using a phrase like,
no concern of yours?
The voice was a bad actor, Control concluded, or had a bad script, or it was deliberate. At the end of their conversation, for no good reason, he told a joke. What's brown and sticky?
I know that one, the voice said. A stick.
A turd. Click.
Go ahead and check the seats for change, John.
Control, back in his office, exhausted, ambushed by odd flashes of memory. A colleague at his last position coming up to him after a presentation and saying in an accusing tone,
You contradicted me.
No, I disagreed with you. A woman in college, a brunette with a broad face and beautiful brown eyes that made him ache, whom he'd fallen for in fundamentals of math, but when he'd given her a poem had said to him, Yes, but do you dance? No, I write poetry. I'm going to be some kind of spy. One of his college professors in political science had made them write poetry to get your juices flowing. Most of the time, though, he'd been studying, going to the shooting range, working out, using parties to get in practice for a lifetime of short-term relationships.
Go ahead and check the seats for change, John, said Grandpa Jack.
Control had been 12, visiting his mother up north for a rare trip that didn't include going to the cabin or fishing. They were still getting the balance right. The divorce was still being finalized. On a weekend afternoon, in the freezing cold, Jack had rolled up in what he called a muscle car. He'd taken it out of hibernation because he had hatched a secret plan to drive Control to a lingerie show at a local department store. Control only had a vague idea of what that meant, but it sounded embarrassing. Mostly, he didn't want to go because the next door neighbor's daughter was his age, and he'd had a crush on her since the summer. But it was hard to say no to Grandpa, especially when Grandpa had never taken him anywhere without his mother there. So, Control checked the seats for change, while Grandpa fired up the bright blue muscle car, which had sat cold for 2 hours while Grandpa talked to his mother inside. But Control also thought Grandpa was reacquainting himself with the mysteries of its workings, too. The heat was blasting away, and Control was sweating in his coat. He checked the seats eagerly, wondering if Grandpa had left some money there on purpose. With money, he could buy the neighbor girl an ice cream. He was still in summer mode. No money, just lint, paper clips, a scrap of paper or two, and something cold, smooth, sticky, and shaped like a tiny brain from which he recoiled. Old bubble gum. Disappointed, he broadened his search from the long back seat to the dark cavern under the front passenger side. He extended his arm awkwardly forward so that his hand could curl around to search, came up against something bulky, yet soft, taped there. No, not soft. Whatever it was had been wrapped in cloth. With a bit of coaxing, he managed to pull it free, the awkward weight of a muffled thud on the car floor. There was a dull metal and oil smell. He picked it up, unwrapped it from the cloth, and sat back, the rough coldness of it cupped in both hands, only to find his grandpa staring at him intently.
"What do you got there?" the old man asked. "Where'd you find that?"
Which Control thought were dumb questions, and then, later, disingenuous questions. The eager look on Grandpa Jack's face as he turned to stare, one arm still on the steering wheel. A gun, Control said, although Grandpa could see that. He remembered later mostly the darkness of it, the darkness of its shape and the stillness it seemed to bring with it.
"A Colt 45, it looks like. It's heavy, isn't it?"
Control nodded, a little afraid now. He was sweating from the heat. He'd already found the gun, but his grandpa's expression was that of someone waiting for the gift they'd given to be unwrapped and held high, and him too young to sense the danger. But he'd already made the wrong decision. He should never have gotten in the car. What kind of psycho gave a kid a gun, even unloaded? That was the thought that occurred now. Perhaps the kind of psycho who wouldn't mind coming out of retirement at his remote cabin to work for Central again as the voice, to run his own grandson. Mid-afternoon. Try again. Control and the biologist stood together, leaning on the sturdy wooden fence that separated them from the holding pond. The Southern Reach building lay at their backs, a gravel path like a rough black river leading across the lawn. Just the two of them, and the three members of security who had brought her. They had spread out at a distance of about 30 feet and chosen angles that took into account all escape routes. Do they think I'll run away? Ghostbird asked him. No, Control said. If she did, Control would put the blame on them. The holding pond was long and roughly rectangular. Inside the fence, on the far shore, a rotting shed lay on the side nearest the swamp. A scrawny pine tree, half throttled by rusted Christmas lights, stood beside the shed. The water was choked with duckweed and hydrangea and water lilies. Dragonflies patrolled ceaselessly over the gray, sometimes black, water. The frogs made such raucous forecasts of rain that they drowned out the crickets, and from the fringe of grass and bushes on the opposite side of the pond came the chatter and bustle of wrens and warblers. A lone great blue heron stood solemn and silent in the middle of the pond. Thunderclouds continued to gather, its feathers dull in the fading light. Should I thank you for this? Ghostbird asked. They were leaning on the top of the fence. Her left arm was too close to his right arm. He moved a little farther away. Don't thank anyone for what you should already have, he said, which brought a half turn of her head toward him, and the view of one upraised eyebrow above a thoughtful eye and a noncommittal mouth. It was something his grandfather on his father's side had said, back when he was selling clothespins door to door.
"I didn't make the wood storks disappear." Oh, wait.
I didn't make the wood storks disappear, he added, because he had not meant to say the first thing. Raccoons are the worst predators of their nests, she said. Did you know that they predate the last ice age? Farther south they roost in colonies, but in this region they're endangered, so they're more solitary. Control had looked it up, and the wood storks should have returned by now if they were going to. They tended to be creatures of habit. This is true, based on my understanding of storks and herons. I can only give you 30 or 40 minutes, he said. Bringing her here felt now like a terrible indulgence, possibly even a kind of danger, although he did not know to whom. But he also knew he couldn't have left things as they were after the morning session. I hate it when they mow it and try to take out the duckweed, she said, ignoring him. He wasn't sure what to say to that. It was just a holding pond, like thousands of others. It wasn't meant to be a habitat. But then they'd found her in an empty lot. Look, there are still some tadpoles, she said, pointing, something approaching contentment on her face. He was beginning to understand that keeping her inside had been cruel. Perhaps now she wouldn't see the conversations between them solely as an interrogation. It's nice out here, he said, just to say something, but it was nice. It felt even better than he'd thought to get out of the building. He'd had some idea of questioning her, but the strong smell of rain and the way that the distant sky formed dark curtains of downpours fast approaching had defeated that impulse.
Ask her about the director, the voice said. Ask her if the director mentioned having been across the border before.
Pushed that away. You're a hologram. You're a construct. I'm going to throw Chum overboard until you're so blood-enraged you can't swim properly. Ghostbird nudged a large black beetle with her shoe. It was frantic, ceaselessly caroming through the links of the fence and back over. You know why they do that? No, I don't, Control said. Over the past 4 days, he had realized there were many things he didn't know. They just sprayed insecticide here. I can smell it. You can see the hint of foam on its carapace. It disorients them as it kills them. They can't breathe because of it. They become what you might call panicked. They keep searching for a way to get away from what's already inside of them. Toward the end, they settle down, but that's only because they don't have enough oxygen to move anymore. She waited until the beetle was over a piece of flat ground and then brought her shoe down, hard and fast. There was a crunch. Control looked away. Forgiving a friend who had done something to upset him, his father had once said that she heard a different kind of music.
Ask her about the empty lot, the voice said.
Why do you think you ended up at the empty lot? Control asked, mostly to placate the audience. Any one of the three might report back to Grace. I ended up here, at the southern reach. A guarded note had entered her voice. What does it mean to you, that place? The same as this place, or more? I don't think it was where I was meant to be, she said after a pause. Just a feeling. I remember waking up and not recognizing it for a moment, and then when I did, being disappointed. Disappointed how? Ghostbird shrugged. Lines of lighting created fantastical countries in the sky. Thunder came on like an accusing voice. Ask her if she left anything in the empty lot. Was it his question or the voice's? Did you leave anything there? Not that I remember, she said. Control said something he had rehearsed beforehand. Soon you'll need to be candid about what you remember and what you don't remember. They'll take you away from here if I don't get results, and I'll have no say in where they send you if that happens. It might be worse than here. A lot worse. Didn't I tell you I wasn't the biologist? She said it soft, but with bite. Ask her what she really is. He couldn't suppress a wince, even though he had meant it when he had said she didn't owe him anything for bringing her out to the pond. I'm trying to be honest. I'm not her. And there's something inside of me I don't understand. There's a kind of brightness inside. Nothing in the medical updates except an elevated temperature. That's called life, Control said. She didn't laugh at that, but said quietly, "I don't think so." If she had a brightness inside of her, there was a corresponding darkness inside of him. The rain approached. The humidity was driven away by a wild breeze. Ripples spread across the pond, and the shed wheezed as the wind pushed against it. The little Christmas pine whipped back and forth. "You're all alone out here, aren't you, John?" He didn't have to answer because it had started to rain. Hard. He wanted to hurry back in so they wouldn't get soaked, but Ghostbird wouldn't cooperate. She insisted on taking slow, deliberate steps. Let the water needle her face, run down her neck, and soak her shirt. The blue heron moved not at all, intent on some prey beneath the surface. And that is where we will call it for today, right about on schedule. Um, Thanks to everyone who tuned in. I'm not sure I've seen Human Commenter tune in, so welcome. Josh Kerr, I've seen you in the comments before, so hi. Glad you could make it. I think you might have made it to one or two of the streams before, I'm not sure. And of course, Warren Steele, old reliable, that you be. Alrighty, yeah, with that, I'm going to go. See you all next week, and we'll continue with the next part of the book entitled Hauntings. So, we got one big spooky bit done, and we've got another spooky bit to come. Actually, we've got a couple spooky bits this go round, come to think of it. It's a spooky book. It's pretty spooky. This one has more instances of what I would consider more outright horror, whereas the first one is just kind of otherworldly and strange, with a few jots of, oh my gosh, what is this horrible thing that is happening? Implied horror, I suppose, and overt. This one, like, I think a lot of the like really traditional horrifying elements, spooky elements in this work very well because they're basically bracketed by a whole lot of bureaucratic and officious nothing happening most of the time. So it makes for this great contrast that I feel works very well, even though a lot of the book not a lot actually happens. Like the book happens over a pretty short time frame. All the events of the book happen within like a week, I think, if memory serves. It's very short. Um, but things are going to get pretty interesting. Our boy Control is going to start losing control, and we're going to learn how little control he ever actually had. Not spoiling anything, I don't feel. I think people can tell that things are not really within his grasp at this point. It's kind of like Spooky Mulder. Spooky Mulder, if he didn't want to believe, and was kind of dense. Control gives off a lot of appearances of being kind of like an idiot, and it's like, why aren't you talking to anyone about this? Don't you think these are things you should talk about? Don't you think you should try analyzing some of this stuff? And he just straight up doesn't. There are reasons for this, however. Partly because he has baggage, and partly for other reasons that will become clear if not in next week's reading, then the one after. I believe we'll know about it next week. We should definitely know about it next week. Things are going to get interesting. Things are going to get interesting in a hurry. Alrighty, with that, I'm going to cut my rambling short. I'll see you all later. Thanks again so much. I really do appreciate it. And thanks for tuning in, Jay Waldrop. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I assume it's not Waldrop. Waldrop. Something like that. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm glad people are tuning into these. It's pretty great. Definitely incentivizes me to start to either tweak my schedule to something more accessible or to start swapping out some of the streams that I'm already doing for more reading streams, just to get more bodies exposed to things. Alrighty. Yeah. Thanks again. Stay safe, stay sane, stay toasty or cool as per your preference. Probably cool, because well, it's cooler today than it was yesterday. Yesterday, East Coast got unseasonably hot. Yowza! Today's a bit more mild, a tad breezier, which is nice. It's a really nice day. Um, I can't vouch for the rest of the country. I'm sorry. I don't know, or Europe for that matter. So yeah, thanks again, and be decent to each other. See you all later.
You could get crucified saying something like that. In fact, people have.
Bye.